Salutations. So, with the resurrection of Chaotic, hopefully more people new and returning will be playing the game. However, since we don't have the new cards that are coming out in October, other than possible art and arrangements, I'm going to be taking a look into an analytical perspective of how the previously published cards look like. This will be information that if you're ever playing in a format that is probably going to be considered a legacy unless they make it backwards compatible, you're going to have questions such as, what cards should go on my deck? What should I consider when deck building? What tribe is the strongest? Which cards are specifically the strongest, both in that tribe and outside of it? Go into a little bit of that into here. However, I'm going to look mostly on the tribes individually and then comparing the tribes together, kind of taking a look into the average distribution of the stats. There's multiple things to consider whenever assessing things. The stat line is not the end-all be-all. You have things like abilities, battle gear, music, location, positioning on the battlefield, and many more things to consider whenever you're actually deck building and playing a chaotic game. Stats are just kind of the base of what a card is. If we go ahead and take a look at Maxor. In this example, Maxor has a courage of 110, power of 75, wisdom of 90, and a speed of 60. And you can see that his energy is 65. Now, that's not to say that a Maxor versus an identical Maxor will always win. First attack is kind of critical in that, and also the attacks used. The abilities used, music's used, etc., etc. So if we have Maxor go against Kaor, we can see that Kaor's stats are higher. And so if we take just the flat stat perspective, we can be like, oh, Kaor is always going to win. However, an example, Maxor has a healing ability. So since he has 2 musics, he can use that twice. And if he does, then hypothetically, Maxor could pull out a win if the correct attack cards are used. To touch briefly, another thing to consider is positioning. If we have Iflar in here, Kaor can attack both of them, and both Maxor and Iflar can attack Kaor. But if we drop Elixia on the battlefield, then Maxor can no longer reach Elixia, but Iflar can. And this is just a quick example of how stats are not the end-all be-all of a game. However, other things to consider. Outperform. This considers the stats. It is a location effect. We have the actual attacks themselves that depend on the stats. This one is a stat fail. We have challenge. We have stat checks. All this can kind of come into the game itself. Now, let's move on to the boring stuff. Now, like I said, we're going to look at all the tribes. We're focused on the cards that came out before the October 2026 Resurrection. And to do that, we're going to start with the overworld. Now, the overworld distribution of stats kind of focus a little bit heavier on the wisdom. However, we can also see that courage is also kind of up there. If we want to look at kind of a more scatter plotted, we can see that the highest it ever goes is 120. And the lowest seems to be 35. We can look at that a little bit better as courage kind of goes into here. We can see that it actually goes down to 30. It might even go lower, but this kind of shows these are all the cards that exist in the overworld and what their courage is. More than likely, if you're going to be having a card, you're probably going to have somewhere between the 55 and 70 range, which kind of reflects up how we had it before, where the courage was 66. We can kind of round that to the nearest multiple of 5 to be 65. And we can see that here, 65 might only have 10, but it was weighted a little bit higher because there's 21 cards that have a courage of 70. Now, moving on to power. We can see this is a little bit heavier on the discipline score. Compared to here, we can see that the kind of average sits around 55. We can see that 55 tends to be actually on the higher ends for just straight up card distribution. You can see that our outliers are kind of 110 because they're just like so much higher. Things to keep in mind. Now, wisdom being its highest score, we can see that the scale starts at 50, but it's kind of consistently all the way up through 90, even kind of consider 100. However, 90 seems to be kind of the highest consistent way. It has an unusual spike of 50, but it kind of hits 90 and trails down. You have a little bit higher. You have the 120. You have 115. Plenty of things to kind of motivate you to make a more wisdom-focused deck. That's probably why one of the metas that exists, or depending on when you've watched this video, existed, was Wise Guys, where it took advantage of Overworld's higher than average wisdom. Now, speed, we can see that, especially even at the top, when we sitting here, our speed was sitting around 55, the same as the power. We can see that this is, again, weighted heavily towards the lower ends. Somewhere between 40 and 50 is probably where you're going to have a card stat be. You can get higher, however, the overworld trends not to be as high. And now for the overworld's lowest stat, we have energy. So on average, we're going to have an energy of 45 to 50. Anything higher is a little bit unusual, but it's still higher than the average. Anything lower exists. If you have one of 3 cards that has max energy of 30, then might be because the card has an ability or some other factor. Now, switching routes into the underworld, we can see that the distribution is different. This one is heavily focused on power. We can also see that courage is the second best, then it is speed, before its next best is energy and wisdom. So with that, we can see this goes a little bit above 120 for someone. However, it also seems to go down to as low as 20 for stats. Now looking at the courage, we can see that we are a lot higher on the scale. This means that you probably have better odds of getting something with higher courage if you have courage-focused attacks, or maybe if you want to have something related to courage. Maybe you want to do challenges. As for the power, we can kind of see that kind of sits through the 70 through 95. However, it does go up to, not unheard of to be 110. As we can see, here's our stat that went up to 125. That's kind of where it capped out, but it also went as low as 25. This also means if you have a card with a max power of 25, you probably know what it is, correct? Now, wisdom. This was the lowest stat for Underworld, so we can see that reflects heavily. If you have a Underworld card, it probably has a very low wisdom, even despite what the show says for certain characters, where they had high wisdom in the show, but they have lower wisdom in actual reality. Now for the speed, it kind of sits on the middling area. It does trend a little bit heavier to the lower ends, meaning that speed is not the main focus on the Underworld. They mostly focus on their power and energy. So the energy seems to be a little bit higher. We know that the KR example was on the higher end. There are also examples of lower ends, but you'll probably get somewhere between 50 and 65 if you're looking for on average. If we compare the two, we can see that the Underworld has an advantage in power by a sizable amount, almost a full 20 points towards it, and it even has a higher energy. The speed is higher, the courage is a little bit lower, and the wisdom. So it kind of has a little bit of pros. I believe that is 2 out of 3 that it is not beating Overworld in. The next tribe we're going to talk about is Dainian, though. Dainians are heavy on their courage. They're very courageous, but they also have a decently high wisdom. They also have the lowest speed that we've seen so far, as well as a lower energy than the previous two. We can see that the outliers on this are not as extreme as the previous two tribes. It only goes up to about 110 or so, and this is only about 25 or so at the low end. But looking more into depth, you can see they're capped out with a couple creatures at 110. However, you're probably going to hit a average range of 75 through 90, which we can kind of see up here. 75, 70 is kind of the closer end, but we can see that more cards have it higher than that, which kind of boosts it up a little bit. As for the power, we can see that it kind of sits on the lower end, especially compared to the Underworld, where we are sitting kind of closer to 60. However, it can hit an average of 45 on the low end. If you have anything higher than 80, then you're probably playing very few cards that are focused on it. However, power is probably not going to be your end-all be-all. That's not to say you can't use power, but it's due to the pattern and what the numbers say, you're probably not going to have as much power. Wisdom was Danian's second best stat. We can see it is kind of heavily in the middle of their own chart, kind of staying consistently between 45 and 80, which means you're probably going to be sitting somewhere in there kind of consistently, kind of ebbs and flows. And if we go back to our chart, we can see that the average wisdom was around 60, which is kind of flat in the center of that range. Next, we have speed. We can see it's speed. Danians are not very fast for being bugs. You're probably going to get something between 35 and 50. Higher than that, it's probably not happening, and you don't really get much lower, which means these are probably the slowest tribe that is available. However, we'll look into that a little bit more in depth. As for energy, they hit in the 45 and 50 area. Let's compare that against the other two tribes. It's the lowest energy. Not much lower than Overworld, but it is the lowest. Overworld still having the highest amount of energy, but it is the lowest in speed so far that we've looked at. Second highest in wisdom, and the second highest in power, but it also has the highest courage overall, which means that they have one of the highest stats and a second place stat happening. Mypedians, this one's going to be a little bit more in depth because there's multiple things to consider. However, the overall Mypedian disciplines, we can see they are emphasizing speed. Speed is critical for them. They have lower power, not much energy. Their wisdom's a bit lower, and their courage is their second best stat. Kind of seems similar to the Overworld with how its stat layout was, except instead of wisdom, they're focused on speed. However, with Mypedians, I wanted to include the fact that war beasts are a factor when considering the two. So we can see this chart is still roughly the same between the two. However, we can see that the power actually dips a little bit below where the energy is compared to with the war beasts included. To look at the outliers of everything, we can see that the high end is 160 for Mypedians, while the low end is around 20. However, without the war beast, we can see that the spread is less clustered and dense from how extreme the war beast can get. And now the high end seems to be about 110, but the low end still seems to be about 20. Looking into the courage, we can see that it goes all the way up to 160. However, you're averaging around the 60 through 75 area. Low average would be about 50. Without them, we're still kind of in the 50 to 80 range. It's a little bit higher, however, compared to how it was before. We've got a little bit less stats, and it's a little bit more centralized in our range of total cards. On the power, we're on the lower end. We can see without the war beast, it kind of flushes out a bit. We're still on the lower end based off the numbers themselves. However, for all of the cards that exist in the Mypedian tribe, your average is probably going to be around 45 through 60 as the most common thing that you're going to be hitting. Wisdom. Their highest stat is 110, which kind of, surprisingly enough, is a war beast. However, the 100 is not a war beast. Wisdom, it's going to get somewhere between 40 and 75. Most likely, you're going to be getting around 60. But that kind of stays consistent even without the war beast, which means we can kind of see that's why their wisdom was kind of consistent as it was. If we go ahead and take a look without the war beast, we can see that the wisdom kind of sat around the 60 stat. We can kind of see here, it reflects that. Now, speed, this was their advantage. This is how they dominated. They go fast, they stay invisible, they hit like an assassin or a ninja, depending on how you want to perceive it. we can see it is rather consistent, surprisingly. Probably the most consistent numbered. However, we know from previous, when we initially looked at the chart, the speed kind of averages around 70 to 75. With that information, we can take a look. Our 70 to 75 is here, and it's kind of a little bit lower than where the two nines are, the two highest amount of cards that have that number. However, if we shave off the War Beasts, which kind of buffed it all the way up to 160, we can see kind of the discipline scores shift a little over to the right. Now you can see why it was a little bit more consistent towards the 70-75 area. Now the energy, they have kind of a lower end of energy between with and without the War Beasts. With the War Beasts, it has a higher cap, or their highest is an outlier, as it is not the most consistent thing. However, they kind of sit consistently around the 50. Compared to the others, we can see that with everyone involved, around the high end, but kind of lower energy, it still sits around 50. The speed is definitely a 5 number difference, or nearly 5 number difference if you want to take the rounding into mind. This is closer to 75 and this is closer to 70. However, we can see that the charts are generally the same. However, for the War Beasts, whenever they're charted out, you can kind of see wherever they sit consistently and how it kind of influences the other two charts. Now against the other 3 tribes, this is where we can kind of start looking as to what they all specialize in. We can see the overworld has the wisdom. They're the wise ones with like Najrin. We have the underworld that has the power on their side, such as Kaor. We have Danians, which have a high courage. We have Mypedians, which are very fast. Now, if we break everything out, we can take a look. As courage is dominated by Danians, wisdom is dominated by overworld, power is dominated by underworld, and speed is dominated by Mypedians. However, out of these 4 tribes, underworld also has a second highest out of everyone's stat, and that being their energy. Outside of that, if we end up taking a look at the stats, we can see that the underworld has 2 stats in the theoretically first place. They have second in courage, kind of tied with the Mypedians, including the War Beasts. Without the War Beasts, we know that's the courage kind of drops a little to be a little bit below. And so it has 2 in first, 1 in second, having the lowest overall wisdom. Danians kind of have the inverse, where they have 1 in first, but they have 2 of the next highest, being their power, which is in the theoretically second place, their wisdom, which is in second place, and their energy kind of sits consistently where everyone else does as well. So if you're ever curious about how the different tribes are kind of arranged, we can see that although the overworld has only 1, they don't ever take the lowest stat overall. Now we see energy over here for the Mypedians. However, if we take a look without the War Beasts, they are boosted. If we include the War Beasts, then the overworld has the lowest energy between those 2. And then also the Danians have a little bit higher, as the energy of Mypedians was 49 and energy of the Danians is 50. Now let's move on to the War Beasts specifically. We saw this chart a little bit earlier. Their kind of plotted points are between 60 and I believe this is 25. However, looking, you can see there's only 11 War Beasts, which means that the weights of the averages are going to be a little bit different. We have courage, which is going to be really high. We can see that it has 90, 90, 40, 105, 70. Technically, this would be closer to 45. However, if we compare that to how the others are, none of the others have a stat near the 90s. And so with that being the highest, their best stat is beating the 70 of the energy. However, it has 3 stats overall, but that's just due to a low number pool. As we can see, there's even less dots than how there were previously. If we look into the courage again, we can see it's very weighted heavily towards the 100. It's a little bit lower just because there's a little bit more cards that have this. However, the high range does extend a lot further. The power is going to be sitting around the 90 again because we are kind of hitting the majority of cards in this range. There's 2 cards on the low end, 2 cards on the high end, and it kind of just middles out to be in the 90. However, if you have a card, it's probably going to be between 85 and 110 as a War Beast. If we look at their wisdom, they have very low wisdom. They have 1 outlier, which is 110, and then everything else is 60 and below, which means we can tell that the War Beasts themselves are not the most wise. However, they do have a decent speed. They are outstripping everything with their speed. With an average of 105 that we talked about earlier, it goes up to as high as 160. As for their energy, they're kind of sitting in kind of a normal range as the others. Still a little bit higher than most. If we remember back to how the average overworld, underworld, Danian, and Mypedian, the highest was 53.68. However, the energy is 70. Not a huge jump, but if we consider underworld out of that, the others kind of sit around 50, which is almost a full 20-point difference. After we touch on the energy, let's hit Morellians. Morellians, we can see that they also have some higher stats than average. One of the things to keep in mind is the influence of their specifically overpowered outlier, which drops everything a little bit. You can see there's a slight change, not a huge one just because it's 1 outlier. However, it does change the numbers a bit. We can see it kind of sits consistently above 60 in everything except for energy, in which case it is kind of around the same range as the other tribes, minus the War Beast. However, drops even lower, as do all the other numbers, when we remove Aeon's avatar, however you say his name. With the plot, we can see why the outlier is influencing it so much. It's because it is so much higher. The highest would be around, 110, 115, and then it just jumps up to 200, which is so much higher than all the other stats. If we remove that outlier, we can kind of see generally how the stat spread looks like on average. Now for the courage, we can see that these guys have a higher courage in the center. A lot of your consistency is going to come to 60 just from the number of counts. You're going to sit around the range of 50 through 70. Their power, they're powerful. Not as powerful as the underworld, but they're still higher than some of the other tribes. You have a high wisdom. Again, sitting kind of in the 60 to 80 range, which is close to what the overworld was, but it's still, I believe, a little bit lower. However, we're still hitting that cap of 200, just kind of influencing and existing there. Their speed is a little bit lower than all the other tribes. We take a look back at our scale of the other tribes. We can see the speed kind of sat around 55, as this one's closer to 60, 55, 50. We can kind of average that out to be 55, and then you have Mypedians, which were just so much higher, with 20 points higher than that average. If you look at without Aeon's avatar, the speed is sitting around 60, which means it is higher than all the other tribes except Mypedians and the underworld on average. However, with how their distribution is, they're actually going to be closer to the 50 to 60 range on average. As for the energy, they have some decent energy. We know Aeon's avatar is going to be sitting there kind of influencing things. However, 45 through 50 is probably where you're going to get the energy for Mypedian. Now let's compare them against the War Beasts. we can see that the Warbeasts have a strong advantage on everything except for wisdom, in which case the Marillions have the advantage over them. Finally, the tribe that we have is the Tribalists. We can see that the Tribalists have some excellent average stats. However, something to keep in mind with that is the spread. We can see there's very few dots here. These dots are because there's only 4 creatures in the Tribalists. How that looks means that on average you're going to hit like 70, but that's just because half of the cards that are Tribalists have a courage of 70, and there's just not a huge resource pool for really decent numbers. That's also why whenever we look at their power, we can see that the scale of the power is looking onto the higher end. However, due to the low numbers, we're not able to give great accurate predictions unless we get more Tribalists. This is probably just going to be where it sits, and you're just going to have to take it as it comes. We can see the wisdom is definitely on the lower end with a high of 55, but a low of 30. And then you have a decent chance at hitting any of them depending on which card you get. The speed kind of sits a little bit higher on average. You can see the 60, 70 to 95. 70 kind of makes it the quote-unquote average. If we look back here, the average is 70 exactly. And then lastly, we have the energy itself, where we're sitting on the higher end of creatures. However, it's not necessarily over the top as we saw some other creatures. For example, if we look at the Marillions and Warbeasts, we can see that it has a higher average than all the other tribes. But that's just due to the low amount of cards that exist for Tribalists. I get it. Probably very tedious and very boring statistical information. However, if you're curious, I will be posting this in the Chaotic Discord. So if you want to ever take a chance, take a gander, look at the average quote-unquote stat spread for a tribe, you can go ahead and take a look there, go through the slide deck, and be able to have that influence your deck building a little bit. So maybe if you need to decide between 2 cards, you can just take a look at this, be like, oh, these are the stats, or hey, these have very similar abilities. Which one has a little bit of a better edge on average? It might be able to influence. However, like I said before, it should not be the end-all, be-all for deck building. Thank you very much.